Well, we have another Ukraine scenario today. The Speaker of Parliament, Mr. Groysman, was supposed to become the new Prime Minister, but he's now pulled out. So we have a typical Ukrainian БАРДАК and a continuation of the political crisis in Ukraine. The key factor here is obviously that there is no political leadership at the level of the president taking place, because Ukraine has been drifting for very many months over the questions of who is going to be the Prime Minister, what is going to be the coalition in Parliament behind the Prime Minister, and also who is going to be the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. And this in turn was all derailed as well by the leaks made from the documents released from Panama, which showed that President Poroshenko had set up offshore accounts related to his business back in 2014. But subsequent investigations by Ukrainian journalists, which are also usually very good, show that this is nothing new, that President Poroshenko has actually been undertaking offshore business deals and hiding his income from Ukrainian tax authorities ever since he's been in business since the late 1990s. And in 2003, President Poroshenko was the subject of a Ukrainian attempt to get Interpol to investigate his allegedly illegal activities in this field. So really, we are lacking strong presidential authority and presidential political will. Ukraine's drifting. There isn't the IMF program in place, and there isn't really a government and a kind of coalition. One would have thought that at least by now a prime minister, a candidate for the position of prime minister would have been chosen from among either Yatseniuk staying in place, Mr. Groysman taking over, the worst of the scenarios, or the finance minister, Mrs. Jaresko, becoming the new prime minister. Of the three potential candidates, Western governments and international financial institutions like the IMF most likely preferred Jaresko to the other two. But they also would have stayed with Yatseniuk if he had wanted to remain in place. But the problems have been compounded by not only the lack of presidential political will and presidential leadership. I mean, how can President Poroshenko have the time to travel around the world to various summits and meetings and government to government meetings when he has these various crises at home that he has to deal with? It seems to me very irresponsible for him to do that. This is also a product of, besides weak political leadership, a product of a failure over the last 3 years to really take a grasp on the questions of rule of law and corruption at the highest levels of Ukraine, and implementing questions of justice related to the former Yanukovych regime, in particular its bankrupting of Ukraine and its murdering of protesters. Because all of that has not been really resolved, the whole question of the oligarchs and where their place are, because President Poroshenko has not instituted and laid down that business will no longer be as usual. We'll have a new type of relationship between business and politics in Ukraine, that this has led to the entrenchment of political forces and economic forces who are opposed to the reforms which Prime Minister Yatseniuk, for all his faults, was implementing at the behest of the IMF and Western governments. And so really we have both of those factors have now built up into a crisis that could have been foreseen and which very clearly resembles Ukraine in kind of 2007, 2008. So after the Orange Revolution, Ukrainian politicians do not seem to have really learnt their lessons. Here, the very fact that President Poroshenko wanted to monopolize the government and impose his own candidate, Mr. Groysman, was very similar to President Yushchenko replacing Yulia Tymoshenko with Yuri Yakhanurov. But we all know how that ended up. It ended up with the returning to power of Viktor Yanukovych in 2006, 2007. So the longer that President Poroshenko fails to implement the demands of the Euromaidan revolution, the longer that he does not impose strong leadership and resolves these various crises, then there's a threat of counter-revolution from the opposition bloc, the former Yanukovych figures, and of course the threat of continued warfare in the Donbass from Russia and President Putin. So Ukraine is not really in a position to waver on these questions, and it's really incomprehensible on the part of I think Western governments why there is no attempt until now to resolve it, and why there has not been, but in particular, listening to Western governments that there's a need to take a grasp of the prosecutor's office, replace Viktor Shokhin with a more reformist candidate. Today, we have heard of two potential candidates for the prosecutor's office: Yuri Lutsenko, who's the president's spokesman in parliament, and investigative journalist Sergei Leshchenko, who is an MP from President Poroshenko's bloc. Of the two, if there is a choice between the two, the best candidate would be Mr. Leshchenko, not because he has any legal background. He doesn't. Neither he or Lutsenko have any legal background. So in this sense, this also resembles after the Orange Revolution, when you had the appointment of Roman Zvaric as the Minister of Justice, and that did not end very well. Roman Zvaric was a Ukrainian-American who moved to Ukraine to live in the mid-1990s. It ended in scandal as well. But why is Leshchenko a better potential prosecutor? Well, the two institutions in Ukraine which have responsibility for fighting high-level corruption, abuse of office, and issues of the rule of law are the Security Service and the Prosecutor's Office. And both of those institutions are absolutely useless in conducting investigations. Absolutely useless. In fact, many cases in the West, in Austria and Interpol and elsewhere in England, have been closed down because of the lack of background investigation and good professional preparation of documents on the part of the prosecutor's office. Sergei Leshchenko, on the other hand, has compiled a huge number of very, very good investigations of corruption in Ukraine. Just go to his articles in Ukrainska Pravda or his blogs on Ukrainska Pravda. He's written books about this. His book from 2015 was about the whole corruption process under Viktor Yanukovych. So he's a leading figure in a very small number of people in Ukraine, amongst journalists who are good investigators. Investigative journalism in Ukraine is not very well developed. So in that sense, Leshchenko has many of the attributes in terms of investigating the sources of corruption and who's involved that the prosecutor's office and SBU don't have. So potentially that could be a very good candidate for President Poroshenko to at least regain some face in that field. But he needs to really resolve this issue of the Prime Minister. And if Mr. Groysman has pulled out, then we really have a choice of either again reaffirming Yatseniuk or Mrs. Jaresko is potentially a new Prime Minister, which would be something that would be very acceptable to Western governments. Ultimately, in conclusion, what we have is a potential threat that a second revolution in Ukraine could fail, and that is not really a good option when President Putin is breathing down Ukraine's neck and waiting for this to happen, which was not the case 10 years ago. And so there really needs to be some development in that. In both cases, after the Orange Revolution and after the Euromaidan, similar kind of people came to power. Not really radicals, but pragmatists, both in the Yushchenko camp and the Poroshenko camp. And the opposition in Ukraine, the National Democratic Opposition, was always really grouped into two halves. One half was what I would term the pragmatists, who were willing to cooperate and willing to turn a blind eye to the oligarchs. And this is the Yushchenko-Poroshenko camp. There's another camp which never came to power really except for a short period of time after the Orange Revolution, and that's the Tymoshenko camp, which today is added to by two new political forces led by Mikhail Saakashvili, the former Georgian president, and also by Samopomych, which is led by the mayor of Lviv, Mr. Sadovey. That group of people have not really been given the reins of power in Ukraine. It's been the pragmatists, the Poroshenkos, the Yushchenkos, and they've failed abysmally on issues of fighting corruption and pushing forward the issue of the rule of law. So maybe it's time for a change. Maybe it's time for a change to a new coalition in Ukraine, which would be grouping together the more radicals in the opposition or in the Euromaidan camp, which would be Samopomych, Saakashvili's political force, and Yulia Tymoshenko's Batkivshina. Ukraine can't keep continuing to muddle along and not deal with these very difficult issues. In the 2015 Transparency International rankings, which is called the Corruption Perceptions Index, of the 15 former Soviet republics, Ukraine has only three. Ukraine's ranking is terrible. Only 3 countries of the 15 have worse rankings than Ukraine on corruption, and they're all in Central Asia. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Russia, who have massive oil and gas reserves, have better rankings on corruption than Ukraine. Ukraine's corruption rankings have not changed in the last 20 years, last 15 years, certainly since the Orange Revolution, hardly at all. One year when corruption rankings did change was in 2005, when Tymoshenko was prime minister. If you go to the Transparency International, you will see how corruption was massively reduced in 2005. But guess who was then fighting Tymoshenko, and which leading to the crisis? Mr. Poroshenko, who was then secretary of the National Security and Defense Council. He was bitterly opposed to Tymoshenko's fight against corruption. So we have a lot of stability in Ukraine's overall entrenched corruption and oligarchs' influence in politics and economics. And the pragmatists, the Yushchenkos and the Poroshenkos, have failed to dislodge that. I hope Poroshenko maybe changes. But in the meantime, it's time to pass the baton to the radicals. And those are those 3 political forces I've talked about. Because Ukraine's reforms and Ukraine's fight for justice and fight against high-level corruption, the rule of law, is something that needs to be radically undertaken and not piecemeal and through backroom deals as it has been done since the Euromaidan. Thank you.